World War II was the largest, most devastating, and bloodiest conflict in human history. Welcome back. Today, I'm not just sharing another history video. I'm sharing a journey through English itself. Every word I speak, every story I tell carries echoes of the past. Echoes of people, of moments, of voices that shaped our world. So don't just listen to practice English. Listen to feel, silence the noise around you, and let the language draw you in, back to the very beginning. And if you'd like to return any time, please subscribe so this journey is always waiting for you. World War II was the largest, most devastating, and bloodiest conflict in human history. No continent stood completely apart from it, not even Antarctica, which saw its own military activity. Battles flared across China, France, Hawaii, Iceland, Somalia, Sri Lanka, the Arctic, and far beyond. The war was fought in trenches, on horseback, in the skies, and beneath the sea. And for the first time ever, conflict even reached into space and ended with the use of nuclear weapons. The war reshaped the entire world. The old European empires, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and others, never recovered their former dominance. The second half of the 20th century would belong instead to two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In Asia, the conflict paved the way for the Communist Party's rise to victory in China, contributed to the division of Korea, and played a part in the birth of an independent India. So when did the war begin? What happened? Who fought? And where? These are the essentials you need to know. When did World War II start? The answer depends on where you look. Its roots lay in the ambitions of expanding empires, territory, power, resources, and wealth. Three dictatorships, Germany, Italy, and Japan, known as the Axis powers, spent the 1,930 seconds enlarging their domains. Germany pushed across Europe, Japan seized northern China, and Italy struck into Africa. Japan and China had already been locked in full-scale war since 1937. Many historians consider this the real opening act of World War II. In December 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the conflict. But for Europeans, Canadians, Australians, Indians, and the vast territories still under European empires, the war began in September 1939. That month, Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany, invaded Poland, triggering a wave of declarations of war and officially igniting World War II in Europe. Why does September 1939 matter? After seizing power, Hitler and the Nazi Party dismantled democracy, persecuted political opponents, Jews, and other minorities, and began constructing concentration camps. His goal was clear: the expansion of German territory. In 1938, he annexed Austria and then parts of Czechoslovakia. But his ambition stretched farther eastward. He envisioned a vast empire built on the fertile fields of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, and lands that had once belonged to Germany before World War I. Poland was the next target. Hitler believed Western Poland rightfully belonged to Germany. He struck a deal with Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, agreeing that the two powers would divide Poland between them. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops poured into Poland. Hitler assumed Britain and France would once again concede, as they had with Austria and Czechoslovakia. This time, they did not. Both nations declared war, pulling Germany into a global conflict. The first phase of the war, events unfolded rapidly. Germany and the Soviet Union carved up Poland. Britain and France offered little effective help. France launched a small attack into Western Germany, but advanced only a few kilometers before pulling back. The Soviet Union invaded Finland, but suffered a humiliating defeat, taking only limited territory in a renewed offensive the following year. Out at sea, German submarines immediately targeted British supply routes. Within hours of the war's outbreak, a U-boat sank the passenger ship Athenia, marking the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, a struggle that would last until the final days of the war. Far out at sea, any German warship still roaming the open ocean was hunted relentlessly. One British task force managed to sink the German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee in the Battle of the River Plate, just off the coast of South America. Across Europe, however, the situation was eerily quiet as both sides stared each other down along the French-German border. In Britain, more civilians were dying in road accidents caused by blackout conditions than soldiers were dying in combat. But this uneasy calm would not last long. In April 1940, both the Allies and the Germans decided to invade Norway, a country whose iron ore resources were crucial for German steel production. Shipments passed through the port of Narvik, making Norway a strategic prize. Germany struck first. They swept through Denmark in a matter of hours and dispatched a fleet toward Norway, slipping past much of the British Navy thanks in part to severe weather. The Allies attempted to reinforce Norwegian defenses, but the German advance was overwhelming. By late May, the last Allied troops had to be evacuated, along with the Norwegian royal family. It was a humiliating defeat for Britain and France. The disaster triggered a political storm in London, toppled the government, and brought to power a new prime minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill barely had time to settle into office. On the very day he visited the king and moved into Downing Street, Germany unleashed its full offensive in Western Europe. A massive force surged through Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and into France. What followed was one of the most stunning upsets in military history. Germany combined tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry in fast-moving strikes that shattered Allied defenses. While the Allies rushed into Belgium, repeating their strategy from World War I, the Germans delivered a second, unexpected blow through the dense Ardennes forest, a route most planners believed impossible for armored divisions. The maneuver caught the Allies completely off guard. In just 10 days, German troops reached the English Channel. The Allied armies that had advanced into Belgium were suddenly cut off from the rest of their forces in France. With no other option, the encircled troops fell back toward the coast, hoping the Royal Navy could rescue them. The Allies formed a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, while the British Navy scrambled every vessel available: warships, ferries, fishing boats, barges, even private yachts. These small craft could pull soldiers directly from the beaches after German bombers destroyed key port facilities. At first, Britain expected to save only 45,000 men before Dunkirk fell, but Hitler abruptly ordered his forces to halt. Concerned that his armored units were overextended and that the marshy ground around Dunkirk was unsuitable for heavy tanks, he paused the advance. That hesitation created a priceless window. Over the next week, an astonishing 340,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated, an event many would later call a miracle. Britain had saved its army, though nearly all heavy equipment had to be abandoned. Sensing that Germany was on the path to victory, Italy joined the war and launched an invasion of southern France. After Dunkirk, German forces turned south with overwhelming power. Within weeks, France collapsed. Hitler toured Paris, posing triumphantly for propaganda photographs. Germany now dominated Western and Central Europe. Yet Britain, encouraged by Churchill's fierce resolve and supported by its global empire, refused to surrender. Hitler now faced a problem. He needed Britain out of the way before he could pursue his true ambition, his vast Eastern Empire carved from the lands of the Soviet Union. He either had to force Britain into peace negotiations or defeat it outright. Germany began planning an invasion of Britain, while its air force was ordered to crush British resistance. The stage was set for the next great struggle, the Battle of Britain. The first great clash, fought primarily in the air, began over the skies of Britain. Day after day, German bombers crossed the channel, aiming to cripple the Royal Air Force. Their strategy was simple: destroy the RAF, control the air, and force Britain to surrender under the weight of relentless bombing. If the skies belonged to Germany, an invasion across the channel might just be possible. But the RAF did not break. Flying Hurricanes and Spitfires machines, now legendary British pilots rose to meet every formation of enemy aircraft. They attacked from above, from the sun, from the flanks, shredding bomber groups and forcing German formations to scatter. The Luftwaffe quickly discovered that fighting over enemy territory meant downed planes and lost crews. The losses were becoming unsustainable. Behind the RAF's resilience lay one of the most important innovations in modern warfare: radar. Britain had built a chain of radar stations along the coast, able to detect enemy aircraft long before they reached British airspace. This information fed a brilliantly coordinated network of command rooms and fighter groups. At exactly the right moment, RAF squadrons would scramble, climbing into the sky and intercepting German raids with uncanny precision. It was the world's first fully integrated air defense system, and it changed everything. As summer 1940 wore on, the RAF remained stubbornly unbroken. Frustrated and increasingly desperate to force a British surrender, Hitler shifted tactics. Instead of military targets, the Luftwaffe turned its bombs on London and other major cities. Night after night, explosions echoed through the streets as entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. This period became known as the Blitz, a campaign designed to terrorize civilians into submission. Yet British resolve hardened rather than weakened. Families sheltered in stations and cellars, emerging each morning to sweep away the debris and carry on. By mid-September, the outcome was undeniable. Germany had lost the battle for the skies. The RAF still stood, battered but unshaken, while the Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses in pilots and aircraft. Hitler, who had once spoken confidently of crushing Britain, was forced to admit that conquering the island was now impossible. Without air superiority, an invasion would be suicide, especially with the Royal Navy lurking in the Channel. Germany switched to night bombings, but the dream of defeating Britain quickly had collapsed. Yet Britain's struggle extended far beyond its own shores. In the Mediterranean, the British Empire and Fascist Italy clashed where their colonial holdings pressed against each other across North and East Africa. British forces overran Italian East Africa, reclaiming Ethiopia and forcing Italian troops to retreat. But the battles in Libya and Egypt proved far more brutal. Desert warfare demanded men, fuel, and machines in enormous quantities, and the front shifted back and forth in dramatic sweeps. Meanwhile, late in 1940, Italy launched an invasion of Greece, an operation that turned into a catastrophic embarrassment. Italian forces were pushed back and humiliated, and Mussolini, outmatched, appealed to Hitler for help. The German dictator could not afford to let his ally collapse. In the spring of 1941, German troops swept into Yugoslavia and Greece, overwhelming both nations in a matter of weeks. But even victory came at a cost. The Balkan campaign consumed precious time and resources that Germany desperately needed for its true objective. That summer, Hitler prepared to unleash the largest invasion in the history of warfare, Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June 1941, he shattered his pact with Stalin and hurled nearly 4 million soldiers eastward. More than 3,000 tanks spearheaded the assault, supported by thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, and even 500,000 horses. The Soviet Union was struck with overwhelming force. The Red Army reeled. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions were killed outright or taken prisoner, many of whom later died in camps from starvation and relentless abuse. Even Stalin's own son was captured and would not survive the war. Town after town fell, and by autumn, German spearheads were driving toward Moscow itself. But then the advance slowed. The Soviet Union, though badly wounded, refused to collapse. As temperatures plummeted far below freezing, German vehicles failed, weapons jammed, and soldiers suffered frostbite and exhaustion. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing German units back from the gates of Moscow. Hitler's expectation that the rotten structure of Soviet power would collapse with a single hard blow proved disastrously wrong. Instead, he had opened a vast, grinding war that would devour entire armies. While Germany faltered before Moscow, events thousands of miles away were about to transform the World War into a truly global conflict. Japan, bogged down in its brutal war against China, desperately needed rubber, oil, and strategic materials found in Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders feared that the United States, alarmed by Japanese expansion, would intervene to block their ambitions. Their solution was bold and ruthless. Strike first, cripple the American Pacific Fleet, and seize the resources of Southeast Asia before the United States could respond. In early December 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers crossed the Pacific in complete radio silence. At dawn on December 7, they launched hundreds of aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. Torpedoes sliced through the harbor waters, bombs plunged onto battleships, and explosions tore across the naval base. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and more than 2,500 Americans were killed. The attack shocked the world. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and within days, the global alliances shifted irreversibly. World War II had entered a new and even more enormous phase one, in which oceans, continents, and entire civilizations would be drawn into the struggle. When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the conflict finally became the global cataclysm many feared it would become. America now found itself fighting 2 titanic enemies on opposite sides of the world, Japan across the Pacific and Germany across the Atlantic. What had once been separate wars in Europe and Asia now merged into a single worldwide struggle. Japan, meanwhile, unleashed a coordinated expansion across Southeast Asia almost simultaneously with its attack on Pearl Harbor. As American battleships burned in Hawaii, Japanese troops stormed British Malaya, then advanced into Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces fought desperately before surrendering. Within mere months, nearly all of Southeast Asia had fallen under Japanese control. Tokyo seemed unstoppable. The year 1942 would determine the shape of the war. It began with sweeping Axis victories but ended in crushing defeats. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces pressed onward. They seized Burma, marched toward the borders of India, bombed northern Australia, and sent their navy deep into the Indian Ocean to attack Sri Lanka. The Japanese Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of India. In the Soviet Union, German and Axis troops drove across the grain-rich plains of Ukraine and into southern Russia. By late summer, they approached the city whose capture Hitler believed could break Soviet morale, Stalingrad. But the German blitzkrieg, so effective elsewhere, bogged down in brutal urban combat. House by house, room by room, soldiers fought among the ruins. Yet in the Pacific, that same summer, Japan suffered a devastating blow. American codebreakers had cracked key Japanese naval communications. Armed with this knowledge, U.S. forces ambushed the Japanese fleet near Midway. Dive bombers from American carriers struck 4 Japanese carriers in rapid succession. Flames engulfed the decks, and within hours, Japan lost the core of its naval power. The tide of the Pacific War began to turn. In North Africa, Axis forces led by the famed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surged deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and British supply lines. But in October 1942, the British struck back at El Alamein. Their victory forced the Axis into a long retreat across the desert. Only days later, American troops entered the European North African theater for the first time. In Operation Torch, US, and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, creating a pincer movement with British troops advancing from Egypt. The Axis position collapsed rapidly. By the spring of 1943, all Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Meanwhile, at Stalingrad, one of the most decisive moments of the war unfolded. In November 1942, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Within days, they encircled the entire German Sixth Army. Surrounded by snow, hunger, and relentless Soviet attacks, the Germans clung to the ruins. By February 1943, the last remnants surrendered. It was a shattering defeat, one the German army would never fully recover from. Throughout 1943, the Allies tightened their grip. Each night, waves of British and American bombers pounded German industrial centers. In May, a daring British raid destroyed major dams, supplying water and hydroelectric power to the Ruhr, striking at the heart of German industry. On the Eastern Front, the Germans attempted one final major offensive, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. But the British had intercepted German plans and shared them with Stalin. Soviet engineers constructed immense defensive lines. When the German assault began, it was met with brutal resistance. After days of grinding combat, the Soviets counterattacked, forcing the Germans into retreat. From this moment on, Germany fought a defensive war in the East. In the Atlantic, Allied naval forces, British, American, Canadian, and others, developed new techniques to hunt German U-boats. Equipped with improved radar, sonar, escort carriers, and coordinated air-sea patrols, they sank submarines in such numbers that the German Admiralty suspended operations. The U-boat threat was finally broken. In July 1943, Allied troops stormed the island of Sicily. It was the first time Allied boots touched the homeland of an Axis power. Shockwaves rippled through Italy. Mussolini was deposed and arrested. But even as Italy's new government surrendered to the Allies in September, German forces swiftly seized control of the peninsula, turning Italy into a bloody battleground. The Allies now faced a slow, exhausting climb northward. Across the Pacific, the United States took the initiative. Adopting a strategy of island hopping, American forces advanced along two lines. In the south, they pushed through New Guinea and neighboring islands. In the Central Pacific, they assaulted the Gilbert and Marshall Island chains. With each leap forward, Japan lost airfields, naval bases, and the ability to defend its vast empire. As the Axis situation deteriorated, the Nazi regime escalated its genocidal campaign against Europe's Jews and other persecuted groups. Millions were deported to death camps, industrial centers of murder operating within a shrinking German empire. By 1944, the walls closed in on Hitler's forces. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union unleashed massive offensives, sending millions of men sweeping across the plains, smashing German armies, and liberating territory. Huge swathes of Europe became battlegrounds as entire populations were caught in the tide of war. By early 1944, the momentum of World War II had shifted entirely. In the east, the Soviet Red Army crossed into German territory, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward its homeland. In the Pacific, American forces delivered blow after blow to Japan. The mighty battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf nearly annihilated the Japanese Navy. Aircraft carriers that had once dominated the Pacific now lay at the bottom of the ocean, and Japan could no longer project power the way it once had. Island by island, the United States advanced. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell one after another, turning the Mariana Islands into launch platforms for American bombers. From these airfields, U.S. aircraft could now strike the Japanese home islands, unleashing destruction on an unprecedented scale. Japan, increasingly desperate and without meaningful options, launched one of the most unusual attacks in the entire war. They released explosive-laden balloons into the jet stream, hoping they would drift across the Pacific and ignite fires in America. Most caused no damage, but one explosion killed 6 civilians in Oregon, the only Americans killed on the continental United States by Axis forces during the war. Japan also attempted to invade India, but their offensive stalled and then collapsed at Kohima and Imphal. The dream of expanding westward was crushed. Meanwhile, Europe prepared for its defining moment. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allied powers, Americans, British, Canadians, and others, launched the largest amphibious invasion in human history, D-Day. In a single day, about 150,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel aboard more than 7,000 vessels. Paratroopers dropped from the sky while waves of infantry stormed the beaches of Normandy. German machine guns, firing from reinforced bunkers, cut down men as they scrambled ashore. The fighting lasted for hours. On Omaha Beach, the U.S. Army suffered staggering losses before finally breaking through. By sunset, all 5 beachheads were secured. Over the next days and weeks, a flood of troops, tanks, and supplies poured into France. Germany rushed reinforcements into Normandy, and the region descended into a brutal war of attrition. Villages and hedgerows became fortresses. It was not until August that the German defenses finally cracked. The Allies burst out of Normandy, swept across northern France, and liberated Paris by the end of the month. For a moment, it seemed the war in Europe might end quickly. But Germany still had strength left. In September, the Allies attempted a daring plan to seize key bridges in the Netherlands, including the one at Arnhem. Operation Market Garden failed when German forces counterattacked fiercely. The war dragged on into yet another bitter winter. In December, with snow blanketing the forests, Hitler launched his final gamble. German forces struck through Luxembourg and Belgium, punching into Allied lines and creating a massive bulge on the map, giving the battle its name. The Battle of the Bulge was fierce, chaotic, and costly. But Allied reinforcements arrived in time, and the German attack was turned back. The losses in men, tanks, and fuel were catastrophic for Germany. It was the last major offensive the Nazis could mount. By 1945, defeat was inevitable. Yet the Axis continued to fight savagely, prolonging suffering across continents. As spring arrived, Allied forces in Italy pushed north, liberating the last Axis strongholds. On the Western Front, German forces even destroyed large dams in an attempt to slow the Allied advance, causing widespread flooding. But nothing could stop the momentum. In March, the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, one of Europe's great natural barriers, and swept into Germany. By April, they were within 50 miles of Berlin. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched enormous offensives. Nearly 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surged into Poland and East Germany, overwhelming German defenses. Stalin was determined that the Soviets, not the Western Allies, would be the first to reach Berlin. He pressed his generals relentlessly, and they delivered. By late April, the German capital was surrounded. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, inside his bunker. Hours later, they both took their own lives. With the Führer dead and no hope left, his successor, Admiral Karl Donitz, authorized an unconditional surrender. On May 7, the war in Europe ended. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. 43 million dead, 2/3 of Europe's Jews murdered, entire cities obliterated, art and culture wiped out, a continent left in ruins. But the war was not yet over. Japan continued fighting. American firebombing campaigns reduced Japanese cities to ashes. The empire had collapsed. Food, supplies, and hope were all fading. Yet Japanese troops fought on with ferocity. Battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa cost tens of thousands of American and far more Japanese lives. Their tactics grew increasingly desperate: kamikaze attacks, suicide charges, hopeless last stands. Allied planners prepared for an invasion of Japan itself, estimating that millions might die. But in the summer of 1945, the United States unveiled a weapon unlike anything seen before: the atomic bomb. After years of secret research, the first nuclear test in New Mexico turned sand into glass. The new president, Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death, made the grim decision to use the bomb to force Japan's surrender. On August 6th, a single bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb devastated Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands perished instantly or suffered horrific injuries. Almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, launching a massive invasion of Manchuria. Japanese defenses crumbled. With no path left but annihilation, Japan surrendered. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Second World War formally ended. The world that emerged was transformed. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. Germany was divided into East and West. The United States became the dominant global superpower, eclipsing the exhausted British and French empires. Japan was occupied and rebuilt. Korea was split in two. Vietnam began its struggle for independence. China plunged into civil war and, by 1949, came under communist rule. In countless ways, the modern world we live in today is still shaped by the consequences of World War II. And that brings us to the end of today's journey through history and language. If any of these stories moved you, remember this: every new word you learn keeps a fragment of history alive. So keep listening, keep feeling, and keep exploring the world through English. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss what comes next.